Welcome everybody to Illinois Learn to Hunt late season deer hunting strategies. So we're excited tonight to present this new webinar to y'all. And before we get started, just got a few reminders. If this is your first time or you haven't been with us for a while for a webinar, just to remind everybody to leave your cameras off and also keep your mics on mute. This prevents any background noise. Also, if you have any questions, you can place that in the chat. If the sound drops out or anything, you can put that in the chat if you have any issues with that, and we try to help you out. If the whole webinar drops out, just give us a second. And it's only happened one time in the summertime. So if that ever happens, just hang out and we'll be back to get that figured out. Then also we'll have time at the end of the webinar for any questions you guys may have that we didn't answer in the chat or during the presentation. So stick around for the question and answering session at the end. And also a reminder that we're going to email you a handout and also a copy of this PowerPoint. Then we'll also be emailing you a copy of this webinar and a survey that we will use to help us to help us figure out the curriculum going forward. So if we didn't cover anything, or if you liked something or didn't like something, let us know, so that way it will help us figure out how to keep this program growing. Our presenters tonight are going to be Dan Stevens. Dan, would you like to say hi real quick?
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us tonight.
Thank you very much, Dan. Then also I introduce Adam. Adam, would you like to say hi?
How's it going, everyone? Thanks for joining us tonight.
Hi, Adam. And then I'm Jason Buckley. Welcome, everybody. And also we have with us Curtis. Curtis, would you like to say hi?
Good evening, everyone.
So we'll be tag teaming this, and we'll be passing it off between speakers so that we don't get tired of one of us. Hopefully like all of our voices, but some more than others. So for our course outline tonight, we'll have a late season overview, followed by local bedding areas, locating bedding areas and using satellite topo maps to help you find those bedding areas and the food areas, and then find those feed areas, find patterns of deer, and some late season hunting tips at the very end. And we'll talk a little bit about ways to dress in the cold weather if you're not used to that yet. So the primary rut is over. Now what? That could be an alternative title for this entire webinar, right? So the deer are done rutting. They're through mating, at least their main rut, and they're moving to different areas. So where to find them at. So we're going to start talking about where about the deer biology and ecology, and how to find them in late season. So Dan, we're going to start by talking about second rut.
Yeah, thanks, Jason. And yeah, like Jason mentioned, the primary rut, which is, for those who aren't familiar, is kind of the primary breeding season for deer. And in Illinois, that primary rut is typically between November 10th and November 14th. That's kind of when the majority of does are bred in the state. Now, obviously the primary rut is over. We're about a month past that date. So there is this kind of uptick in deer activity that you can kind of correlate to this second rut. And the second rut is essentially, it happens in December, about 28 days after the first does go into estrus. So again, 28 days after that November 10th through November 14th. So that's kind of right where we are right now. So, December 15th, you can consider that the second rut. Now, the second rut is, if you've ever hunted the primary rut, a lot of times you're going to see huge deer activity. You're going to see bucks chasing does constantly. The bucks are going to have kind of one thing on their mind, and that's breeding as many does as they can. You can see that kind of activity during the second rut, but it's on a much smaller scale to an extent. A lot of the does have already been bred during that primary rut. And so the second rut is only those does that were not successfully bred during the first rut. And then occasionally you have some of the young from the previous year. So at this point in the season, they're about 7 to 8 months old. And depending on their body condition and their weight and their nutrition, some of those fawns may also start to go into estrus cycle and be receptive to be bred. And so you can see a slight uptick during this kind of time period. Now, me personally, I don't I don't really strategize too much around the second rut, and a lot of that is just due to the lack of rutting activity that you're likely to see out there. You can certainly see a lot of younger bucks kind of chasing does as they're still full of testosterone. They're really not sure what's going on, so you might see a lot of the younger bucks starting to refresh in scrapes or make rubs or even start to harass some does. But again, for the majority of this presentation, we're going to be focused on kind of one thing, and that's how to hunt the late season. And the late season can kind of be defined as, I like to define it as anything after muzzleloader. And so muzzleloader was this past weekend in Illinois. And so now we have, until the middle of January. And so there's a lot of hunting season left, about a month or so. And so it's important to understand what deer are doing, where they're doing it, and how they're moving across the landscape. And so that's what we're really going to dive into today, is understanding these bed to feed patterns and how, as a deer hunter, we can put ourselves in kind of the best spot to increase our odds. And so obviously there's a bunch of physiological as well as behavioral changes that we need to understand as hunters. So these deer are physically changing. Not only is, obviously the habitat's changing, but also the deer themselves are changing. Their metabolism is being reduced. They have an increased energy consumption. And so if you think about the primary rut, there's been lots of studies that looked at how much caloric energy adult mature bucks use during primary rut. And so there's a lot of studies that show that on average, a buck can lose up to 15 to 20% of his body weight just during that primary rut. And that's a pretty sizable number. And if you think about, the impending winter that's coming, they need to rebuild up those fat reserves so that they can survive through the winter. And so that's the primary thing, the primary behavioral change you're going to see during the late season is the bucks particularly are going to hit the food hard. The does are as well, but the bucks are hitting it kind of in a different way, right? Because again, they have to build up those fat reserves for winter. And so again, just to kind of summarize where we're going to take this conversation is late season can really be boiled down to hunting kind of a singular concept. And that singular concept is the bed to feed pattern. So find out where these deer are bedding, find out what they're feeding on and where they're feeding, and how can we predict where we can be in the middle of that to make sure that when they're following this pattern, that it gives us a shot opportunity. And so here's a quick illustration that just highlights, and you'll notice as we go through this presentation, it's really detailed into what we wanted to show is some real world examples. And so we're going to use a lot of this satellite imagery and topo maps to kind of break down some of these hunting sites that might be productive in the late season. And so that we can hope to, help narrow down some of these tactics. And one of the biggest things, particularly in the late season, when you're hunting this bed to feed pattern, is to use the terrain that's out there that's going to naturally funnel deer movement. And so if you can see in this particular map, we have this doe bedding area on the west, and on the east, we have a pretty standard feeding area. But if you notice where that X is, you essentially have a funnel. And so you have this kind of oxbow in the river that forms this kind of U shape towards the north side of that X. But then on the south side of that X, you can also see these topo lines. And those topo lines are kind of the brown lines running across kind of diagonally. And the closer those lines are together, that indicates a steeper slope. And so that is a decently sized slope. And remember, deer are just like us. They want to take the path of least resistance. And so very often you're going to see them just kind of naturally follow alongside of the bottom of a ridge. And that is very common. And so in this particular scenario, you have the river on the north and you have this fairly steep slope on the south. And so that just naturally funnels deer movement between those two areas. And so setting up in between those two areas is going to funnel that movement, hopefully all within bow range. But now I want to talk about deer bedding. And the majority of this presentation today is going to really dive into specifics of bedding. We're going to go over several different types of bedding areas that you're likely to see. But first, we want to define a few things so that we're kind of all on the same page. Deer spend more time bedding than engaged in any other behavior. Their typical bedding periods are about 30 minutes. And now obviously that's going to change depending on weather, on climate, and on a bunch of other factors, as well as hunting pressure. But typically they're going to bed for about 30 minutes. They may get up, stretch, go eat a little bit and go back to the same bed, or they could transition to a new bedding area. Now, doe groups are typically going to often bed near each other. And so that's the big distinction between a doe bedding area and a buck bedding area, is how they essentially utilize these areas. So does are often going to be bedding alongside other does. Very commonly, bucks, they want to be on their own. And their bucks are, I guess the best way to describe it is when you look at a buck bed, you're going to say, holy cow, this is a very ideal and thought out setup. When you start considering the wind and the sight advantages, as well as the hearing advantages, they essentially take everything into account when they bed in a specific spot and for a specific reason. And as you start to be able to identify what some of those features are, very often you can look at a map and start to predict areas where you expect a buck to be bedded, because it's fairly repetitive. Again, it's taking all these things into account: the wind direction, its sight lines, and as well as its hearing lines. So mature bucks, again, are very specific about where they bed. They're going to be bedding alone, where the does are going to be bedding in larger groups. The weather is also a huge impact in bedding locations. And so now we're going to introduce this concept of thermal bedding areas. And as we get a little later on in the presentation, this will start to make a lot more sense once we start looking at some satellite maps and some topo maps. But thermal bedding areas are essentially areas where the deer knows that this specific spot is going to be warmer for one reason or another. Thermal areas, if you're not familiar with the concept of thermal, have you ever seen buzzards kind of flying in the sky where they're just kind of up and soaring? Very often those buzzards and vultures are in what we call thermals. And so these thermals are rising columns of air. And typically you have rising thermals in the morning, and in the evening you have falling thermals. And so that's really important in choosing a bedding site, because they can use that to their advantage. Because again, rising column of air, not only is it just creating this rising column of air, but it's also pulling up scent alongside with it. And so they can position themselves on a ridge to position themselves in a way that they can use those thermals to aid in their kind of predator avoidance senses, so to speak. So very often you might find them in thickets, down in kind of river bottoms, but very often on hillsides. And we'll get into that a little bit later when we discuss this concept of leeward bedding. That's arguably one of my favorite kind of strategies in terms of finding buck bedding areas, is looking on the leeward side of hills. And again, we'll dive into all those in a little bit. But again, we want to find where they're bedding and where they are feeding and take advantage of being kind of in between the two. We also have solar bedding areas. And so if you think about a natural hill or a natural ridge, there's very often two sides, kind of a north facing slope as well as a south facing slope. And if you've ever heard of the company North Face, they produce kind of not really high end, but just kind of consumer grade outdoor equipment, fleece jackets, that kind of thing. That name comes from, they want gear that allows you to survive on the north face of a slope. So north face of the slope, it's very often going to be a lot colder because it doesn't receive the same amount of sunlight as a south facing slope. So the north facing slope essentially gets very little solar radiation from the sun in kind of the mid winter, where the south facing slopes are going to receive much more of that solar radiation, which creates a little bit more of a warming atmosphere. And so very often during the kind of midwinter and peak winter, south-facing slopes are excellent bedding areas for not only mature bucks, but also to find lots of does. They can bed on these south-facing slopes and just get in the sun and kind of just, enjoy and soak up the rays, so to speak. But now I'm going to quickly turn it over to Adam, and he's going to discuss a little bit of how we use satellite imagery to identify potential bedding, and then we'll transition to how do we use topo, so topographic maps, and then we're going to put those two pieces together and actually look at a bunch of maps and go over some strategies of where we would expect deer to bed and kind of why. So take it away, Adam.
Thanks, Dan. So like Dan said, we're going to be talking right now about using satellite imagery. So here on the left, we have a few resources listed where you guys can find satellite images. One of the main ones is Google Earth Pro, Hunt Illinois, for if you're going to be hunting in Illinois. It's the new DNR website, which can be very useful. And then Onyx Maps, which is a paid subscription resource, and there's many others that are just like that as well. So cool thing about Google Pro or Google Earth Pro, it's free to download for any computer you have, PC, Mac, or Linux. And one of the biggest things that we look at when we use Google Earth Pro is that it has the ability to go back in time and see what the landscape used to look like. So here we have a zoomed in kind of picture here of the tool. If you guys do download Google Earth Pro, it's going to be this where this arrow is pointed. It's going to be a clock, kind of with the arrow wrapping counterclockwise. So we're going to be kind of reversing time and seeing what it looked like in the past. So for this, one back, please. So for this specific area image we're going to be looking at, it has a picture all the way back to 1998. Some sites or some images are going to differ. It just depends on when the satellite took images and things like that. So you might not have this many pictures going back in time, but you might have a couple to at least work with, which can be, super useful. You hopefully have one with leaf off that we're going to be looking at here in just a second. There might be even one with like snow on the ground, things like that. So check that out for the hunting area that you're hunting. You might find something that you've been missing the past couple seasons, and it can unlock some key areas that you might not be checking out. So again, leaf off imagery allows you to find unique vegetation, especially areas that are thick with evergreens, shrubs, or cedar thickets. As you can see where the mouse is pointing right now. If you go to the next slide, I believe it blows up the image. Yep, so here you go. You guys are able to see where the ridges are, all the valleys, that cedar thicket here that the arrows or the mouse is pointing at. So super important there. You're able to see kind of thick CRP areas. You're able to see if fields were tilled or planted in the past, if it used to be food, if it's not food now. It's super nice because you're just able to see what the land changes are over time. And of course, you're able to see where creeks and rivers are. And kind of the thickest areas is where you're going to be wanting to focus now that are close to food. So this right here is going to help you a lot to find those thick green shrubby spots on the map.
And I'll jump in just to add a little bit onto that. And the reason it's so important to be able to identify some of these evergreen trees and cedar thickets is they provide really good kind of thermal regulatory capacity for bedded deer. Obviously, in particular, if it's snowing or raining, it allows them to get out of that and get some protection. But also on a very windy day, obviously everything else is pretty much empty in the forest. All the understory has started to go into dormancy, so it's kind of died off. There's not many leaves on the tree. And so very often that wind is just able to kind of rip through that timber stand. And some of these cedar thickets, again, they're going to retain those needles and those evergreen leaves and just be this kind of gnarly, nasty thicket that protects wind. And if you've ever been, obviously we're in Illinois, so there's a lot of farm ground, right? And so what do most people use as windbreaks? They use these evergreen trees. So if you're ever driving by an old farmstead, it's very common to see that house kind of surrounded by cedars, by spruce, or in some cases, maybe even some pines. And so again, we as humans use them to block the wind. Deer will do the same thing.
Yes, thank you, Dan. Good explanation there. Another thing that you guys will be able to find using the satellite imagery is potential sanctuaries. So by this time of the season, deer have been pressured for the past several months, and this usually pushes the deers to areas that, of course, there is less hunting pressure, where people have not been tramping around through the woods, making a bunch of racket and leaving a bunch of scent. They're going to want to find that hidden dark corner where no one's going to bother them, and they know they're going to be safe until the season ends. So these are usually going to be spots that are pretty hard to access for people on foot. So, for example, steep terrain, far distance from the closest parking lot, and one of the biggest ones we like to look at, which are water crossings. So this is kind of an extreme example here. We have the Kankakee River, but you are able to hunt this Longham Island right here. So, this is kind of an extreme case, but there may be spots like that on areas that you're hunting that you will be able to notice that people definitely aren't going to. They're kind of out of the way, maybe not noticeable on a different kind of map. So just look out for those thick areas, like Dan said, all that thermal cover this time of year, especially if we have a big weather swing with a bunch of snow or rain or wind, and those back hidden corners that a lot of people are not going to. And with that, we're going to toss it back to Dan to talk about topography and what kind of maps you guys can find on those.
Perfect. Thanks, Adam. And this is, I would argue, one of the most beneficial aspects that a hunter can do from their house. Obviously, on the ground, boots on the ground scouting is the most beneficial thing you can do as a hunter to increase your odds of success. But while you're at home, being able to understand topo maps, read them and interpret them, but also be able to understand how those topographic changes are going to influence deer movement across the landscape. And there's a bunch of really good resources for topographic maps. Arguably the biggest and most widely known is the U.S. Geological Survey. You can get really big topographic maps that you can even have printed. That they'll print big to scale, 2 by 4 feet topo maps if that's something you're interested in. But you can also kind of view them free here online. Another really good resource is obviously Onyx Maps. Like we've mentioned, there's a bunch of other phone apps out there. There's Hunt Stand Light, HuntWise. There's probably 15 or 20 if you just search for them. But a really good one as well, particularly if you're hunting on public land in Illinois, is this new Hunt Illinois website that Adam kind of touched on a few minutes ago. It's got, again, topographic layers built in, but it also allows you to quickly overlay the kind of boundaries for that specific parcel. And so you can click on a specific site like Kankakee River State Park or Des Plaines State Fish and Wildlife Area, and you can click on it, and it's going to overlay that boundary directly on the topo map. And so that can be really impactful and useful as well. Now, again, I'm just going to kind of highlight this. Even though Illinois is a relatively flat state, the little topography that we have, particularly kind of in the central and northern part of the state, that is still going to impact deer movement substantially. And being able to understand, again, how it influences deer is very important. Again, just like we, as humans, we have a tendency to be lazy. Deer tend to prefer the path of least resistance. And so here you can kind of see, I reiterated this point of a funnel or pinch point, just to kind of, again, highlight that. And so again, I just want to highlight this Hunt Illinois map because I think this is one of the best features that Illinois DNR has kind of built into this new Hunt Illinois website that they launched this year, is the ability to have all of these maps, in an updated, in a nice, user-friendly way. We've all looked at hunter fact sheets in the past, and some of them were hand-drawn, not to scale. Some of them look like they were made in the 70s or 80s. And so this is just a real nice way, again, to be able to overlay topographic maps directly on those site boundaries. And so if you go to huntillinois.org, there's a big tab that says Hunt Map. And when you're in that, you can click this where I have the arrow, and it's going to open up a bunch of other map layers that you can kind of toggle on or off. And so you can see here at the bottom, there's one called USA Topo Maps. And so that is the one I would recommend. And if this is now we're gonna, I guess, dive into how to read a topo map a little bit. And again, this is just kind of the bare basics. And if you know this, just kind of stay with us for a few minutes, and I promise it'll be worth it. But the main point to know about topographic maps is this concept of contour lines. And so these contour lines are essentially increments that show elevation. Contour lines will never intercept, they never cross, they are always forming a circle. And so you can kind of view it as kind of a cross section of, let's say, a ridge. So you have this cross section of a ridge that just kind of goes down, down, down. And the closer that these lines are together, the steeper that slope is going to be. And so you can see here up at the top, we have a fairly gentle slope, but then here at the bottom, those lines are really tight and close together. And so that's going to be an extremely steep slope. In that case, it almost looks like a cliff drop just because it's so steep, but that is a very steep slope. And now another kind of important thing to know about contour lines is there's a couple different types of contour lines. And so you have this index line, which is kind of the oftentimes they're either darker or a little bit thicker of a line, but those are all going to be marked with a specific elevation. And so it's going to show you exactly what that elevation is for that contour line. And so then you can kind of start to count up or down using these intermediate lines that are typically between a couple index lines. Now, most maps are, especially in Illinois, they're printed at kind of a 10-foot elevation. So every contour line that you see is about 10 feet. Again, that can change depending on the map source you use, but very commonly it's going to be dictated in the map scale what the spacing is on those contour lines. And so now I'm going to show you a couple features, and we'll just quickly go over these because I think it'll be a lot more evident as we start to look at some of these specific hunting sites. But an area of a saddle is kind of a low-lying area between two ridge points. And so if you look on the kind of up left section of the saddle, you can see there's a circle just outside, right where the cursor is highlighting. And then on the right side, you also have another peak. And so the saddle is going to be kind of a slight depression between these two peaks. And you'll understand why that's important a little bit later on, but those are very common areas for bucks to bed. So that's a really important feature to highlight. Another really common thing to see, again, we kind of looked at it a little bit earlier with that really steep slope, is this concept of a cliff. And so here you can see that pretty substantially. And I will go ahead and say kind of a quick caveat. If you look at where that cliff face is, if you look just up on top of that ridge, you can see it kind of flattens out a little bit. And those areas are what I call a ridge point. And you'll understand why that's important later, but that is a very high quality area for bucks to bed. I would say probably 6 out of the last 8 or 9 bucks that I've harvested have been using a bedding area very similar to that, that a lot of people kind of call a ridge point bedding. You can also see on these maps the ridge line. And so those are a little bit more difficult to decipher. But again, you can kind of see those 2 circle peaks, and that ridge line is just going to kind of follow that. Valleys are pretty easy to recognize, particularly if at the bottom of a valley there's some kind of river or stream or water source. As you can see on this map, it's kind of delineated with these blue dotted lines. That's very common to see on topo maps. Okay, so now we get into the fun stuff. And this is where, again, we're going to slow down and spend a little bit more time here. And if you have any questions about the illustrations that we're showing or about the specific bedding strategies that we're discussing, again, just type those into the chat and we'll try to address those as quickly as possible. But how does topography impact deer bedding? We kind of discussed a little bit how it can impact movement, but how does it impact bedding? So topography is it's going to impact obviously the wind speed. It's going to impact wind direction. It's going to impact solar radiation. So this concept of the south facing versus north facing slope. It's also going to impact the visibility for bedded deer. As they're bedding, they like to have very good sight lines so that they can, again, look out for predators and look out for other disturbances. And so these are all kind of 3 things that we're going to dive deep into each of these bedding strategies. And so here are kind of the 6 different strategies that we're going to discuss. South-facing bedding, north-facing, leeward bedding, ridge point bedding, and then oxbow bedding. And we'll kind of touch on this concept of established sanctuaries a little bit more kind of than Adam did a little bit earlier. But these are where we're going to spend quite a bit of time moving through this presentation. So south-facing bedding. So how do we identify a south-facing slope? Well, again, I'm just going to kind of reiterate the importance of a south-facing slope again. They're going to receive more solar radiation for longer periods of the day, particularly during the midwinter. And this actually impacts the soil conditions on that site. So it's also going to impact the vegetation that's there. It's going to impact the plant communities that are there. Very commonly, you'll see south-facing slopes are going to green up earlier in the spring, and very often they're going to stay green just a little bit longer than those north-facing slopes. But why these south-facing slopes are so important is, again, this concept of solar radiation. And so if you look at this topo map, you can see we have 2 index lines separated again by about 50 feet. So that shows you that's a fairly steep slope. And again, most maps are orientated in the north-south way. So north is going to be at the top, south is going to be at the bottom. And so if you can visualize these contour lines in kind of a 3-dimensional way, you can see that this slope is kind of facing in the southern direction. And so that's primarily what I'm looking for. And south-facing slopes are extremely productive for bucks, but really, really, really productive for doe bedding areas. Very commonly when it's really cold, one of my biggest strategies is just to go stalking and kind of walk through some of these south-facing slopes and look for bedded deer. And a lot of times that's going to give you some pretty good information. You may not be able to sneak in there and get a shot right away, but very often it's going to hopefully give you an idea of, okay, they're bedded here, they're facing that way. I can see their trail is coming from this direction already. So chances are they're going to be feeding here. And so that's really good information for us as hunters. And now I should kind of preface this whole kind of conversation with a quick rundown of what a deer does during the day during midwinter. Now, if you're thinking about early October hunting, in a lot of cases, we're hunting this kind of same pattern, the bed to feed, and then the feed back to bed. Now, when are deer bedded? So during the winter, very commonly, they're going to be bedded during the middle of the day. And again, they're going to be on these south-facing slopes, getting as much of that solar radiation as they can. So very commonly during the late season, we're typically going to be targeting kind of these afternoon hunts. Very commonly, if you're hunting in the morning, they're typically already going to be back in their bed, and they're going to typically kind of hang out there until it's time to get up and hit the feeding location again in the evening. So most people don't hunt the morning sits during the late season. I would try to steer most of your efforts towards that either middle of the day hunt or kind of that afternoon and evening session. And again, that's because they're going to be feeding into the night and throughout the night. Excuse me. And chances are they will already be back in those bedding sites before that morning hunt starts. And so this bed to feed pattern that we're talking about is they're going to be bedded till, an hour or so before sunset. And that's when they're going to get up and start transitioning to those feeding areas. Now, north-facing bedding can be just as impactful, but kind of obviously in the reverse. And so on a north-facing slope, if it's a very hot day, if you're having a very mild winter, think about what the deer physiology has changed during this period. They've put on a lot of fat. They've put on a nice winter coat. Their metabolism has slowed down to kind of retain energy. They've been eating a ton of food. And so very often, if it's a really, really, really warm spell, you'll find them on the north side of slopes trying to get out of that sun and try to get cool. And so if you have a relatively mild winter, you have maybe a 4-day spell where it gets up to 50, 60 degrees, and it's been 20 or 30 right before that, north-facing slopes can be a really good option to get in there and try to find those deer as they're kind of cooling themselves. Now, this is one of I think the cooler kind of bedding strategy that we're going to talk about. Now, this strategy is called leeward bedding, It was kind of popularized by a man named Dan Infolt. He was previously a writer for Realtree, and he still might be, but now he kind of runs his own YouTube channel and hunting show called The Hunting Beast. But he was the one who kind of popularized this idea of hunting on the kind of leeward side. Now, it's important that we define leeward. So leeward is essentially if you're situated on or toward the side of the ridge that's sheltered from the wind. And the opposite of leeward is going to be the windward, which is going to be situated on the side that is facing the wind. And so you can see in this specific example, the wind is coming in from the north. And so you're going to be set up again on that south facing slope in the leeward side. And again, it doesn't really matter that this is a south facing slope for this example. It could be a west or an east. The big thing is just that you're on the leeward side of that ridge. And this does a couple things. And one of the big things that it does is it creates what some people have kind of termed a thermal tunnel. And so this thermal tunnel is kind of an effect that happens when the wind blows over an elevated object and kind of meets these rising thermals. And so again, if you think about this concept of the sun comes up in the morning, it's going to heat the ground, which then heats the air, which causes this air to rise. And so you have this rising column of air, and then you have the wind blowing over it. And so you have where these kind of two areas meet creates almost what most people call a thermal tunnel. And so the wind blowing over the ridge kind of creates a vacuum. Okay. And it essentially helps pull the rising thermal up the ridge. And so the point where the ridge or where the wind over the ridge and the thermals collide is kind of this thermal wind tunnel. And typically that's going to be about 1/3 of the way down the ridge. And very often you're going to find bucks bedded there 1/3 of the way down the ridge, and they're going to be looking downhill. And from this position, they have a really good advantage of being able to smell both from above, again, because you have that wind ripping over top of the ridge, but also from below as you have this thermal column of rising air. I apologize for the train noise. But essentially, again, you have this, again, the wind coming over the top, pulling scent from behind them, and then this thermal column of rising air in front of them, pulling air up to them that way. And so now they can basically scent check what's behind them and what's in front of them and cover both of those areas in one specific bedding location. And so if you think back to what I said a little bit earlier when we were talking about buck bedding in general, of how when you look at a buck bed and say, oh my gosh, this is an ideal setup, when you start considering again the wind, the sight lines, the hearing advantages, and how they take everything into account, this is what I kind of referenced, is this kind of bedding location. And so these are really, really common for bucks, particularly in the late season as they begin to, again, they've been hunted for October, November, and most of December at this point. So almost 3 months. You know, there's been people in the woods. They've seen an uptick. They've probably been shot at. They've been called at. They've seen people. They've smelled people. And so they are very, very, very particular about their bedding sites because, again, there's so much pressure. And so these kind of sites where they have pretty much everything covered, they know nothing can come from behind them because they're going to smell it because of the wind. They know nothing can come in front of them because those thermals are going to be pulling that air up to them. And so typically, if I'm hunting a site like this, I typically want to be offset on that ridge. And so if you look where this kind of ridge starts to make kind of a south-facing dive, and there's kind of this big peninsula of timber, those are the areas I like to set up. Again, if you try to set up on this ridge or really near where you think that buck is bedded, 9 times out of 10, he's going to see you, smell you, hear you before you even know he's there. And again, that's why it's important to also identify where they're feeding so that hopefully you can get in between the two. But this is one of my favorite late season buck strategies, is finding these leeward bedding sites. Another really good strategy is ridge point bedding. And I mentioned earlier, the majority of the bucks that I've harvested recently have all been bedding in areas like this. And again, that's because of this whole concept of, again, they have sight line, they have scent line, and they have hear, where they can hear. So they have all these advantages at their kind of fingertips, well, hoof tips, I guess. But ridge point bedding essentially you're going to look for ridges. And so you can see, again, we have these, what we call the index line. So these really dark lines. So you can really clearly see where that ridge is and where it starts to drop off into this gimlet branch creek down below. And so you have these pretty decent ridge points that jet out almost into that valley. Deer are going to feel extremely, extremely, extremely safe and secure in these bedding locations. A point extending off a ridge or hill also creates kind of that same funnel effect that we discussed a little bit earlier when I showed that kind of bed to feed pattern. It creates these two funnels of essentially, I guarantee you where this X is, if you went to the right about 50 yards where you can kind of see that draw right at the start of the letter P, and then to the left, you can kind of see this other finger that comes out of that ridge or out of that creek bottom. I would bet that there's two significant trails in each of those kind of draws, and they're going to come to a funnel basically right at that ridge point. So not only does this give the buck a good advantage, but it also gives him a sight line for does. But I'll kind of take a step back. So deer will very often use these to bed on because they can kind of sit with the wind coming down the ridge, and the buck is going to be facing into the valley, into the lowland in front of him. And again, he knows nothing is going to come up that ridge without him seeing it. That wind coming off his back, nothing's going to sneak up behind him without him smelling it. And so these are the types of areas that I really like to look for, is these ridge point bedding. And very often when a buck is kind of in one of these ridge point beds, very commonly they're going to sneak down one side or the other. So it might be on the right down that draw, and then it's going to hit the creek and just disappear into the thicket. He could do the same on the west side of this ridge point. So that's where you as a hunter have to try to figure out where they're feeding. And in this particular case, what I'm going to look for is active trails where a buck can sneak through an area without you noticing. Because very commonly these bucks, especially late in the season, they didn't survive this long throughout the season by using bedding areas that are inadequate or by being stupid. They survived this long during the season by being smart and by using very secure bedding sites. And so think about that as you're hunting some of these sites. But ridge point bedding are very productive to hunting bucks and does. And here's another example of a ridge point bed. If that wind is coming from the west, again, he or she is going to be bedded on that ridge point facing into the lowland in front of them. The wind is going to be carrying any scent from anything that tries to approach from the back. They have a beautiful sight line in front of them of the lowland. But again, they also have those thermals, that rising column of air in front of them that's going to be bringing anything up from the bottomland. In that lowland, it's going to be carrying that scent directly back up to them. So again, you can kind of view it the same way as the leeward bedding. They had scent coming to their front and to their back. And so that's why these areas are so particular, and why, again, when I first started this conversation, you're going to say, wow, this is an ideal setup, because very commonly it is. Another strategy is this concept of an oxbow bedding. And so an oxbow is essentially a bend in a river that kind of creates a bowl-shaped loop. Typically, there's kind of a small area of land connecting it to the mainland. It's almost like an island that just hasn't quite become an island yet. Now, these are fairly common in Illinois on a lot of our rivers, the Kankakee, the Kickapoo, the Middle Fork. And so these are really good areas to find. Most commonly, these are going to be buck bedding areas. I haven't seen too much activity in the past of does utilizing these areas, and I think a lot of that is just because the bucks are already in there, and they're primarily using these areas. Now, the big challenge here is as a hunter. This is one of the, in my opinion, the toughest buck bedding areas to try and hunt. Again, because there's only one point of access for you as a hunter, and the deer has it covered. So you can see the wind is going to be kind of coming from the mainland. The deer is going to, again, face the river. Just kind of like that ridge point bedding, he's going to be up, looking down over the lowland. The thermals are going to be rising up to him from the front. The wind's going to be carrying the scent from the back. he's safe. He knows he can get out of any situation that he has to. And very commonly, if they need to escape, they're just going to run across the river. That might seem, at first like, will they really do that? Yes, they will swim. I've seen deer swim across the Mississippi, across the Illinois. They will certainly do it. And so, don't go into these areas and say, oh, well, he's not going to use that because that water's deep. They certainly will. And again, so in these areas, he's going to be facing the river, the wind coming at his back, carrying any scent or sound coming up from behind him, and any thermals are going to be, again, pulling up the front, as well as, he has those really nice sight lines looking over that river. Now, finding these Oxbow bedding sites are a little difficult, particularly if it's a river that is utilized by a lot of different, user groups. If it's kayaked or canoed, or there's a lot of bird watchers or hikers, chances are a buck's going to notice there's a lot of pressure in the area, and he might, pick a different location. So try to find an area that doesn't have a lot of, human traffic on the river. But again, that dominant wind is going to be blowing from the dry land. And now this, again, I mentioned earlier, this is one of the toughest bedding sites to hunt, especially with the way the wind direction is in this specific example. If you were to set up anywhere along kind of the mouth of that Oxbow, that deer will smell you in 15, 20 seconds. And so again, these are those areas where, in this specific case, if I was hunting this field and I knew there was a really mature, or, if there was a nice deer that I wanted to target in that specific area, what I'm going to do is what I call a reconnaissance or an observation set. And so I might set up on one of these big fields that are kind of out here to the west and try to get in a position that's not going to blow my scent directly over his bed. And I'm just going to sit there. And very commonly, utilizing these observations or reconnaissance hunts, especially during the late season, is going to show you how these deer move through the area. Because again, they're very commonly this time of year, they're going to be feeding in big open fields. And so being able to see how they enter a field, how they leave a field, how they move through a field can hopefully help you pinpoint where to set up next time. Now, I will say that this caveat goes for pretty much all of the bedding sites or the bedding strategies that we've discussed so far. Is if you happen to, maybe let's just say you're walking through this area, you find an area that kind of looks like this, and you're like, oh, let's go see if there's a buck bedded in there. If you walk in there and kick up a bed, I want you to immediately look and pay attention to what that wind direction is going to do. Because very commonly, a buck is only going to use a specific bed depending on the wind direction. And he will change where he beds based on that wind direction. So if you ever kick a buck out of his bed, note the wind direction. Does are not as picky because again, they're typically bedding in larger numbers. And so they don't have to be as specific because they have, very commonly there's 8 or 9 does all bedded together. So that's 8 or 9 sets of eyes. That's 8 or 9 noses. That's 8 or 9 sets of ears, all looking, out for predators. So they're not as picky, but bucks are very picky about when to choose a specific bedding site. Oh, and I guess I should have transitioned a little bit earlier. But when a deer leaves an Oxbow, if he knows a predator is coming up from behind, he'll just go across the river. But if he's just moving out to feed, he could either go over the river, but very commonly he's going to work directly into the wind. Because again, that gives him an out. It gives him a safety net that where I'm walking, I know I don't smell anything up in that direction. And so it's kind of a safety line. So again, if you set up at the mouth of that Oxbow, deer are going to smell you. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Curtis, and he's going to discuss some late season feeding habits.
All right, thanks, Dan. So the other half to this bed to feed equation that we're kind of drilling home here is the feeding aspect. So it definitely is going to be beneficial to know a little bit about the feeding habits of deer, and the name of the game is going to be seasonal availability. Take advantage of what food sources are seasonally available where you hunt. The good news about food sources, they're a little bit easier to pick out, through scouting or even aerial maps than than bedding sites might be. So that's pretty good. They stand out. And then in terms of how deer feed, we want to talk about browsing. So that's when deer are nibbling off the tender shoots or new growth of twigs and leaves of trees, shrubs, and other plants. And you'll hear foresters talk about a browse line when deer densities and populations get too high. You can go down in the forest and kind of duck down at a deer's height and see this clear browse line where everything is kind of browsed right off there. And then deer are also grazers, so they will continue to eat green, browse, grasses when they're available, especially in suburban areas. Could be somebody's prized planted hostas or some plants like that, but deer are definitely good at finding some good things to nibble on out there. We'll go on to the next slide. So we want to think about efficiency here. So obviously deer don't have all the luxuries that we do. Go home to a nice warm bed and a refrigerator. They're trying to survive out in the environment at a time when resources are kind of at their lowest point of the year. So they're going to be very focused on being incredibly efficient. And that means trying to find food sources near bedding areas. And that might even be food sources that you don't immediately think about. Obviously, we all think about the ag fields. There's no shortage of agriculture in Illinois, and certainly the deer want to take advantage of that good and seasonally abundant food source. But to take advantage of bedding areas that offer them refuge and safety, they're going to utilize a lot of browse that might be lower in protein and fat content, but has a greater availability and is where they feel safe. So keep in mind that bucks are very worn down after the rut. They've been chasing and trying to breed as many does as possible. So they're worn down, conditions are tough. They're going to need to eat a lot and as often as possible. They're going to move as little as possible. So if they can find all the food resources they need within a very small amount of acres, then they're gonna stick on that small piece of ground and basically wait out the poor conditions until resource availability gets higher in the spring. Okay, move on here. So back to the crop fields. Obviously, Illinois, no shortage of the crop fields. And you can see here in this picture, we've got some nice green browse and then also some standing corn in there. So they've got best of both worlds, little green browse and a little grain. But obviously, some of the more popular crop fields to keep tabs on are soybeans, corn, the brassicas are good because it actually can offer the deer two different food sources. They'll have the green browse they can nibble on, especially earlier in the year. And then later in the year, the turnips and the radishes offer sort of a protein and fat-rich, persistent food source that they can dig up when they really need it. Green browse, all the grains, all these are going to be popular food sources. Nice thing about late season, we may, and hopefully here pretty soon, be getting a little dusting of snow, which also gives you the opportunity to look for sign and know that it is fresh. And so you can be sure what particular food source deer are focused on at that particular time, and then focus your hunting efforts on that. One cool thing I want to mention about how deer can eat standing corn, they kind of do it like a ninja. They can go in there and somehow, I don't know how they do it, kind of maneuver their way through the husk and basically eat all the kernels off the cob and then leave it so that it looks almost undisturbed. you kind of got to go in there and peel that husk back and see that the kernels have been eaten to know that the deer have been browsing on it. So by comparison, if like a raccoon was in there eating that corn, it would look like a bulldozer was loose, and there'd be no question that it's been eaten. But we'll move on here. So continuing on with this agricultural food source, obviously this is the gold standard for many late season hunters. If you've got some persistent waste grain, a field that's got high quality forage out in it at a time when deer are basically hurting for nutrients, they're going to be all about that. And standing crops especially, they could be, that grain could hang on a little bit later in the year, not be as accessible to as many critters, so might have greater availability to deer later in the year. But harvested crop fields are going to actually have what we can consider a higher detectability. So even though the waste grain might be accessible by more animals, it might disappear more quickly. Deer in a harvested crop field are going to be much easier to spot, going to be easier to detect than in a standing field, obviously. So that can be a great crop field to observe. And it's not uncommon in the winter to see some fields, if there's a good amount of food available, there could be large numbers of deer utilizing the same field. So obviously, if you see a giant congregation like that, that's a good clue that you might be looking for some entry points into that field to set up a bow stand or blind. Okay, so just to expand on this a little bit more, so Dan mentioned this earlier, but we're going to talk a little bit about this reconnaissance hunt, or a recon hunt, if you will. So especially if you haven't had enough time to adequately scout a property, but you have time to hunt in the late season, you want to get out there, you do the work you can by looking at maps and all that. But rather than just kind of going in blindly and potentially disturbing deer in their beds, or spreading scent around and making a ruckus, you could try to pick out a point like where this X is on the map, where you can sort of enter a field with kind of the main purpose to just observe. So you obviously you're going to bring your bow, but you're probably not going to be thinking that you're going to get a shot on this day one sit, and you may not even set up on a trail or within archery range of a place that a deer is likely to be. But you can select a spot because it has a real good location. Think about some of the same things that a buck might think about when it's choosing a bedding location, except of course our nose isn't nearly as good, so probably forget about that part of it. But in terms of sight, we're pretty good too. So get a nice setup where you can observe as much of this property as possible, and get an idea what areas the deer are using. And then after your first sit, you might have an idea that, okay, it looks like deer are kind of moving from this north portion and cutting right across the corner of the field. You can move in a little bit closer on your next time and get a more precise location. And then by your third or fourth sit, you'll be basically ready to be right in the middle of the action, and hopefully you'll have got there without causing too much of a disturbance. All right, some woody browse. So believe it or not, even before agriculture was common in the Midwest, deer did survive here. And in the winter, deer can do some pretty amazing physiological things where, as mentioned earlier, their metabolism can slow down. They can sort of persist on eating lower quality foods and just kind of conserve all of their energy and put that towards staying warm and surviving the winter. So during this time, they're not going to be actively growing or anything like that. They're just going to be persisting, but they know that spring is on its way and times will be better soon. So some of this woody browse includes buds, twigs, and all the new growth tender shoots that make up trees and woody shrubs in the forest. Really common browsed upon species: white cedar, dogwood, sumac, white pine, and maple. So we can see some cedar and pine and sumac here in the picture. All of that can be really good late season browse that can maybe not be quite as energetically saturated as waste grain, but certainly another food source that's available that can help deer persist through the tough winter. And deer are opportunistic. They've been found to eat over 400 species of plants. So if you've got a good species-rich, biodiverse forest or field with a lot of native species, chances are there's going to be a lot of different things that the deer like to eat there. So let's talk a little bit about acorns. Everybody knows acorns are a favorite food of deer, turkeys, number of other wildlife. Acorns are a great food source, and they're persistent. So high in fat, really help to put on those fat reserves that help the deer to survive times when food can be hard to find and when the air temperature gets pretty cold. Acorn production, we talk about mast cycles and mast years, and these are cyclical and they occur every 2 to 5 years. So some years you may go into the woods and find that there's acorn everywhere, and you can't drop your hat without landing on a dozen of them, it seems like. But then the following year you might go out and barely find anything. So the acorn biomass does change year to year, so something to keep in mind. And obviously the deer movement are going to change depending on that seasonally available food source. Let's see, in years when acorn production is low, then browsing on some of these other food sources become even more important. So it's also important to know what kind of acorns you're dealing with. And a lot of people may not know it, but there is a pretty stark difference. Now, we've got dozens of different species of oak trees, but really we can split these into two broad groups, and that's the red oak and the white oak group. So lots of different species will fit into both of these groups, but the main characteristics you can see on this leaf here on the left, this is going to be an oak from the red oak group, and it has bristles on the tip that you can clearly see, got the arrow pointing at that. And then that leaf over to the right is from a oak that would come from the white oak group. And the reason it's important to kind of know the difference between these two broad groups of oaks is because there's actually some difference in the acorns too, which we'll see in this next slide. So red oak acorns have a 2-year maturation. They also have a higher tannic acid content. This tannic acid allows them to be more persistent and last longer on the ground and also in the tree. So these acorns are kind of like the insurance policy. They last longer, but white oak acorns have a lower tannic acid content. They're more palatable for most species. So white oak acorns are actually going to be preferred when the option exists, but due to the lower tannic acid content, these acorns are not nearly as persistent. And once they hit the ground, if they're not consumed, it doesn't take too long for them to rot right away. So Don't last nearly as long as the red oaks, but they're a little bit more tasty. And with that, we're gonna toss it over to Jason.
That's me. All right. Thanks a lot, Curtis. So now we're going to talk a little bit about when to focus your efforts after you find that bedding and food resources. So the rule of thumb when it comes to late season is to focus in the afternoon. If you have limited time, if you can't make it in the morning, definitely focus in the afternoon. So the reason why is that it's just warmer out. The deer will be up and moving. So if you're going in early in the morning, deer might be moving in the night feeding, trying to stay warm, and then they'll bed down at the coldest part of the day, which is the morning, and till it warms up again. So you could push them out of the beds, or you could push them out if they're still getting back to their beds if you go in too early. So finding that food resource and sitting on that food resource and waiting for them to come to you will give you the best chance of not kicking a deer out off its bed. Like Dan went through all the different bedding scenarios and possibly pushing bucks off those beds because they're so well situated. To find that food resource and sit there in the afternoon and wait for them to come out. And of course, there's always exceptions to the rule. So they want to come out when it's warm out, and they're also going to want to come out when it's cold out. So if there's going to be a cold front coming through and they can feel that, and they're laying there and they're like, you know what, it's not getting warmer, it's getting colder, then that's when they're going to be up moving around too. So so if it's a cold front's coming through, like a severe cold front where it's going to be dropping several degrees, they'll be up and trying to eat, because any warm-blooded animal that keeps them warm is their metabolism. So they're going to want to get food. So if it's starting to get cold, make sure you get bundled up and get out there, because they'll be moving, trying to go find that food too. So that gives you a midday opportunity where they won't wait as long, and they'll be up and moving and trying to find food at that point. And with all this information that we've given you guys, just don't push it. Make sure you do those observational hunts, especially late in the season. These deer are pretty educated to hunters at this point, so they'll be a little bit more skittish. So try to do those observational hunts, pattern the deer. They are much more patternable this time of year compared to preseason and rut when they're running all over the place. So take your time, put a couple days in and figure out how they're moving through the property that you're going to, and set up in a right spot so that way you don't blow your cover, because they're going to be a little bit more skittish this time of year. One way to do some observational sits or without having to sit is using a trail camera. And so one thing we like to highlight for this time of year is using the time-lapse feature on a food resource. So normally when you think of trail cameras, you see all these close-up photos of deer who set off the motion detector on a trail camera. And that's great, but if you're trying to look at these food resources like a field, then you can set them up to take photos every couple of minutes, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 20 minutes, whatever you think the frequency should be for your camera. And you can basically have an observational sit with the camera instead of you having to be out there. So if you have multiple food resources that you are trying to pattern the deer on, that's one way to be in two places at once. So the time lapse, they don't have to walk in front of it, right? So you can have, depending on how many pixels your camera has and how good your quality is on your photo, you could look at a field that's hundreds of yards long and be able to look at an image of it and see if there's deer out there and when they get out there and where they're coming from. So that's a big tip for the end of the season, is just to get these food resources patterned and figure out where they're coming out at. So if you're unfamiliar with trail cameras, they can be overwhelming to some. So if you're going to be using them, we talk about using them, a lot of our stuff is going to be on public land, because that's what a lot of new hunters are hunting on. So, but the theft is common. I already had one stolen this year. I know several other people who had some stolen this year. My mistake, I had a lock on mine, but my mistake was having it within view of the trail once the leaves fell off. So I had mine out there most of the season, and it got taken after the leaves fell off and it was visible from the trail. So it could be other hunters, it could be other people using the public land, could be people who don't like hunters, it could be anybody who just wants a trail camera. So I use the lock on mine, and I'll show you what lock I use, but there's other locks you can use to make them more prevented from being stolen. But some, before I get into that, some criteria for picking out a trail camera. So since public theft, having theft on public land is possible, I would go for a low expensive one. I got 2 for $100 was the brand I got, and it also had a screen on it that I could look at, so I didn't have to take the memory card out every time I went and checked it, and I could check it there. And I had time lapse mode on it, had night vision on, not night vision, but infrared on it, and it could do 3-round burst as well. Why 3-round burst is important is because you could have a doe and then another buck or another doe following it. So if you just have a 1 photo taken, it takes a while for the camera to reset. So having it take 3 photos in a row allows you to get any trailing animals that may be with that doe. So that's important to be able to have. And a lot of these are standard now, so you can find these inexpensive ones with all these different standard trail camera features. And just to point out, in this photograph, we do have a lot of them here. On public land, you're not allowed to screw anything into trees, so they do have straps that come with them. So this was a good photo, but on public land, you wouldn't be able to do that, just a heads up.
And I'm going to jump in really quick and just say, now is kind of the best time to buy a trail camera, but kind of now and
Sure.
through the spring, you'll see a ton of hunting gear just get knocked down to clearance, because again, a lot of times they're trying to clear the inventory so they can get ready for next year's models. And so if you're interested in looking in for trail cams, either for this year or even next year, now is kind of the time to look into that kind of stuff.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I mean, with all the different sales and everything going on. And then, so here's a couple of accessories for trail cameras. I've never seen anyone have one of these, but if you can get one, go for it. There's solar panels out there you could use instead of having a battery powered trail camera. So you can get a solar panel, which can help charge your camera. This lockbox, which is one I wish I had on my camera when I was out in public land, might be helpful if you can get that on a tree there, so that prevents it from being messed with. But a lot of the times people are using this so that way you can't open it. But if you get one of these Python locks that goes around the tree, and make sure you get the smaller gauge of the Python lock so that way it can fit through this little eyelet here, because if the people can't steal your camera, they might take your memory card. So this allows you to lock that. Go back here. This allows you to lock your camera from being opened and having your memory card taken as well. So that's that feature. So if you get too thick of a Python lock, it won't be able to fit through there. And then also having different memory cards, which are much lower price than what they used to be. I think they're about $6. I got mine this year at Walmart, which I remember 20 years ago, they were much more expensive than that. Yeah, so those are just your general accessories for trail cameras. All right, and now I think Curtis is going to take back over and talk about fresh tracks.
No, Dan.
All right.
Thanks, Jason. Yeah, and so now we're just gonna kind of wrap up and give kind of a quick overview of what we've talked about and kind of how we can put it all into action. And so my biggest thing, particularly during the late season, is I'm focusing on changing weather patterns. Those are when I'm going to be timing my sits, and obviously you hope to have some bedding sites located as well as some feeding sites located. But if you don't, one of the best parts about hunting in the late season is a fresh snow. Very often, if you get a fresh snow and you go out the next day after that fresh snow, you're going to get basically up-to-date, real-time information of where those deer were, where they were bedding, and where they were moving. So very commonly, if they're bedding in the snow, you'll see a big spot where they've kind of melted all the snow around. And if it's a popular doe bedding area, you're very likely to see kind of 10, 2 to 3 foot circles on the ground that don't contain snow. And so I love hunting in the snow, particularly in the late season, as most hunters do. It increases your visibility and your ability to detect movement and to detect deer. But again, it gives you this real-time information that's really crucial to hunting deer in the late season. Because again, we're just trying to find where they're feeding. That's kind of the main goal. Obviously, you can set up anywhere in the woods, and if lady luck is in your favor, something may come by. But hunting is all about trying to do the best you can to increase your odds of success. And so one of the best things to do is scout, and late season, scout after a snow. It's going to give you that up-to-date information of where they're moving, how they're moving through an area. And I will say, when you happen to find, if you get a fresh snow and you happen to look for kind of a feeding site, very commonly you'll see these kind of areas where deer are just kind of, walking around in circles. But if you find an active feeding site where they were, perhaps feeding the night before or earlier in that day or something, it's going to look like there was a tackle football game out in that area. Because very commonly they have to paw through the snow. So they're going to be pawing through the snow, looking for acorns, looking for waste grain, looking for, whatever they're happen to be feeding on at that time. And so there's just going to be this big disturbance in the snow. And so that's what you're looking for in terms of a food source. But also pay attention to what the individual tracks look like. I know when I first started hunting as a kid, I'd always see, oh, deer tracks. Okay. And that was like, in my mind, that was good enough for me that I saw deer tracks. But more importantly, and the more experience I get, and obviously this is kind of basic for a lot of people, but pay attention to the directionality of that track. Pay attention to the size of that track. That's going to tell you a lot about the deer that are using that area. So if you're not familiar with kind of looking at the directionality of the track, it kind of points in an arrow. And so you can see at these top pictures, it's going to point an arrow, and that's kind of the direction that they're facing. And now a lot of times you'll see this kind of bottom right picture, and you'll hear a lot of people say, oh, it's got these dew claws, it's a buck. Does can also make that. So don't just see those two dots at the back of a track and say, oh, that's a buck, because that's not always the case. But what you can do is you can tell a little bit about the age of a deer. Now in the snow, this is hard, but the further those toes are spread apart kind of gives you an indication of how old that deer is. But if you're looking for specific buck tracks, a lot of times it's just going to be the overall size of the track. So, some mature buck tracks will almost be darn near close to the size of your hand. My rule of thumb, if I'm looking for a specific buck track, what I do is on my phone, I'll take a bunch of pictures of doe tracks with a little ruler, and then take a buck track, and that way you can kind of gauge it, or you can use your foot and just start to get an overall gauge of the size of different deer tracks. So you'll start to kind of put that together. But what we're really looking for, again, is not just a single deer, that's walking through during the late season. What we're looking at is high traffic, frequented areas. So again, you're not going to be able to pinpoint a specific track in these trails, because there's just going to be so much deer activity on this specific area. And those are the areas that I'm looking for in the late season, because typically those are going to take you to the food sources that are congregating a large number of deer. Now, ground blinds can be a crucial tactic for the late season. Not only can it help you keep warm, because you can take a propane heater in there, you can be warm. I grew up hunting, I always hunted out of a tree. That was just kind of the way I was taught as a kid, and, throughout college and in my early adult years, that's kind of how I bow hunted, was just out of a tree. But the older I get, the more I've started to realize that really hampers your hunting activity. Again, you got to carry this, 20, 30 pound thing on your back. But more importantly, you have to find a very specific tree that you can use. And the more I started hunting these public sites, I was like, man, I really want to hunt here, but I can't find a tree that's suitable for a tree stand. And so I've really switched my tactics into hunting on the ground a lot more. And you don't have to use a ground blind. I've certainly, just kind of hunkered into some of the natural vegetation that's there. But a ground blind can be a great tool in the late season, because you can take, again, a heater in there. It's really good at concealing your scent a little bit, because again, it's going to cut down on the wind that's blowing across your scent. So if you are using a ground blind, you want to make sure to brush it in a little bit. Obviously, this is kind of an extreme example here, but you do want to try to get it to match the vegetation that's there a little bit. I used to trap deer when I first graduated college, and it was weird, capturing deer, attaching GPS collars and things to them. And if we just set up a ground blind that was, no, we didn't brush it in, we just set up a ground blind and then put our bait to capture the deer. It on average took about 3 to 4 days for those deer to feel comfortable to come into the bait pile. And again, they don't necessarily know that it's, a blind. They just know that something's different. I like to use the example, if you were, walking through your living room and all of a sudden you just saw a random recliner that wasn't there before, something would kind of stir some thoughts in you, like what in the world? And so I think the deer kind of think the same way. And so using some of the natural vegetation that's there to help conceal that blind a little bit makes them a little bit more comfortable around that blind. Now, if you are brushing it in on public land, you cannot cut any vegetation. You can only use existing dead vegetation. So anything you find already kind of dead on the ground. You also don't want to use, corn or soybeans or anything that has food. And if you're doing it during a firearm season, you do need to have 400 square inches of solid, vivid blaze orange or blaze pink must be attached to the top of the blind so that orange can essentially be seen from every direction. But ground blinds, again, are really nice because, again, you get a heater, it keeps the wind off you, it keeps your scent down, but it also allows you some flexibility with movement. If you're hunting on the ground with a bow, one of the biggest challenges is getting in prep to draw your bow. And having a ground blind just conceals a lot of that movement, and so you can be a lot more comfortable and you can draw easier without being seen. And another nice thing about blinds is what we're going to kind of talk about next is what to wear during the late season, because this is something that I think is really important. And I think a lot of hunters don't give enough credence to their clothing selection. You want to be warm. If you're uncomfortable while you're out there, you're not going to last long. And then when the opportunity comes to take the shot, you might be shaking because you're cold. You may not be able to draw because you have too many clothes on. And so there's kind of a fine line there. But the nice thing about a ground blind is obviously you can have a heater and some of these other things, but also you don't need to wear camo. Again, the inside of a blind is going to be dark black. And so if you're hunting in a blind, instead of having to buy some of these, other outer layers of camouflage that we're going to be talking about in a second, you can just wear dark clothing. And that'll allow you to just kind of disappear into the back of that blind. And now one thing to quickly highlight that kind of relates to this, if you're using a blind, you want to keep those back windows closed so that you have this kind of black sheet behind you that just, there's no light coming in. If there's light coming in behind you, it allows the deer to see your kind of silhouette moving back and forth. So just keep those back windows closed. But you want to wear layers. Layers are extremely important during the late season because inevitably you're going to get sweaty as you're walking to your setup. And if you're sweating, it is going to be a rough afternoon. So you want to wear layers in thin layers that kind of insulate body heat. But I also try to find wicking layers. So there's a lot of different kind of artificial materials out there these days, but I keep going back to merino wool. It's a really good material that wicks moisture away. It doesn't smell. A lot of these newer materials, they're really good at wicking moisture away, but they start to get kind of a funky, sour odor to them after a little bit. And obviously we don't want that while we're hunting. So I'm a big fan of wearing any kind of merino wool underlayers that are, again, it's going to insulate you a little bit, but it's also going to wick that moisture away. So again, then you want to keep layering. And when I'm walking to a stand, I actually took out a hunter, I guess it was this past weekend, and I was essentially on the way to our location. I was just in kind of a t-shirt, even though it was probably 34 degrees. I don't want to wear a ton of layers when you're walking out there. So again, you may have to take a different backpack that allows you to put some of these clothes in it. But that's my strategy, is layer, 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 so that at any point you can take layers off, because again, you do not want to sweat. So a t-shirt is kind of my go-to. Typically, I'm going to wear a merino wool undershirt. I might wear a light t-shirt or a long sleeve t-shirt on top of that, and then kind of a hoodie. And then I'm going to get into my insulated layers.
And yeah, Dan, oh, never mind. You covered it already. I was going to say, I do the same thing this year. I started taking my climber out and then strap my backpack. I used to try to carry it under my arm, but this year I've been going farther back in. So I finally took my backpack and strapped it to my climber. and had all my clothes on that, and been walking out wearing a t-shirt or a t-shirt and a sweatshirt, and then getting out to the stand and I almost ditching that t-shirt because by the time you get out there it's sweaty, and then putting on that under layer of the insulated material, and then being set from there, because it is just a bugger to be out there wet and sweat.
Yeah, especially, you know, if like we mentioned earlier, you really want to focus on these cold fronts. And a cold front during the, you know, early January, it might get down to 10 degrees at sunset. And so you want to be able to maintain a nice warm temperature. And so make sure that all the moisture is wicked away and you take off those layers if they happen to get sweaty. Again, so just like we kind of reiterated, try to pack in most of the outer layers and finish getting dressed at your hunting locations. So an outer layer of fleeces are very good insulators. I wear a lot of fleece, particularly on, you know, on top of merino wool and on top of maybe a hoodie or something. Insulated boots, there is very few purchases that a hunter can make that'll have the impact of a high quality pair of boots, particularly insulated boots. And just in case you're not familiar with the rating system for insulation, it's typically by grams of insulation. And so you'll see kind of 400 is kind of a baseline that's kind of for, you know, decently cold to moderate activity. So 400 grams is kind of what I wear, you know, during kind of a rut hunt into late November. But during January, I'm wearing 1,000+ gram boots. So personally, I wear muck boots that are the Arctic Pro, I think. And again, we're not affiliated. We're just kind of giving our recommendations. So I personally really like a very thick insulated layer of boots because again, for me, the first thing that gets cold is my toes. And when my toes get cold, I'm done. And so I try to make sure to get really nice quality boots that are warm and that also have a good ankle support. And they're also waterproof. That's really important, especially in the late season. Again, a lot of these areas we talked about have some kind of water feature near them. And it even goes back to this conversation that Adam touched on of established sanctuaries and just finding areas that rarely see human intrusion. And so these areas are fairly often swamps, marshes, or other thickets that might have some kind of flooding or water source. And so having waterproof boots is really important. I did notice we had a question. Besides the threat of theft, is there any legal reason preventing somebody from leaving a ground blind set up on public land? That's a great question, Benjamin. And unfortunately, yes. Obviously, theft is a big concern if you were to leave a tree stand or blind out on public land. But what you need to look for is the hunter fact sheet for the specific site that you're hunting. Some sites allow you to leave up a ground blind or a tree stand all season. Others require you to take it down every day. Excuse me. And so it just depends on the specific site that you're hunting. And so just check those hunter fact sheets and it's going to tell you basically you can leave a tree stand or ground blind up or you need to take it with you. And then on top, insulated layers are good. So you can get insulated bibs or insulated coat. And this is where I differ from, I think, a lot of other hunters. I know a lot of the hunters I have hunted with or spent time with in the past, they all have bibs like this, or they have coveralls that are kind of one big jumpsuit that are insulated. But what I've found is a lot of the hunting equipment, especially kind of the insulated, they are so expensive. It seems like if you add a camo pattern to anything, add 50% to the price. And so what I have personally found is I actually just bought a very cheap kind of oversized coat. And so typically I wear a large size coat. I bought an XL. And so then I can wear whatever insulated coat I want. So very commonly it's just, your standard Carhartt coat, but then I can put my cheap camo coat over top of it. And that's a really great way to save some money. So you don't have to buy these very expensive insulated camouflage layers. You can just kind of use some of the stuff that you already have. And so that's another kind of tip. And again, that every hunter you ask is going to do it differently, but that's kind of the way I prefer to do it.
Something else to think about when you're looking for outerwear, you can also wear a lighter camo too when leaf is off. Sometimes if you're up in a tree stand wearing these darker camos that we have photos of here, might silhouette you. So the idea is to break up your silhouette. So you might look at having a lighter color camo. So that's the time of year to look for that as well.
Yeah, and one thing I actually tried last year that worked out reasonably well. We had a snowstorm come in. We probably got 4 inches of snow overnight, and I decided to go out that evening and just sit on the ground. And what I did is I just took a white bed sheet and I just took it with me as I was sitting on the ground. Then I just kind of draped it over my legs and kind of up my body a little bit. And again, that just kind of helped me blend right into the environment. So kind of think outside the box. You don't always have to, go get the Sitka gear, 400,000 gram insulated bibs that cost $600. Very commonly, you can use stuff that you probably already own. Again, deer can't see color. And so, like Jason mentioned, a lot of it is just breaking up our silhouette. And the first couple deer I actually harvested in my life, I was wearing blue jeans and a plaid shirt, kind of a red and black plaid shirt, just because, again, that's that natural pattern that just kind of breaks up your silhouette. But just to kind of to wrap up, for late season success, we want to find food, we want to find bedding, and we want to figure out what the deer are doing in between the two. And then you also want to think about how you're going to approach a setup. Like Jason mentioned a few times, these deer are pressured. They're educated to hunters. They know where hunters are. There's actually been a few studies that looked at where bucks bed, and they GPS collared, I can't remember what state it was. I think it was Kentucky. But they essentially GPS collared a bunch of bucks on public land. And I think it was like 15 to 20% of those bucks were bedded within 150 yards of a parking lot. And they just watched hunters get out of the car, walk down the road. And then once, things start to quiet down, that's when they'll get up and move. So it kind of all depends. And that's why it's, again, just trying to figure out where the deer are bedding and where they're hunting and how we can infiltrate those two areas to put ourselves in a position where when they come through, they're hopefully within bow range. And here's a couple quick recipes that we always like to share. We always like to close out our workshops and webinars with a couple recipes. So these are some of our favorites. This venison roast sandwich is amazing. And it's one of those really easy ones that you can just put in a crock pot and kind of let go. And you'll have a nice warm meal at the end of the day. But this stuffed venison backstrap is probably one of the best backstrap recipes that I've personally tried. We've recommended it to a bunch of other participants who have come through the program, as well as fellow hunters, and they all have great remarks for this specific recipe by Camp Chef. So that's another really good one to try. And something else we always like to highlight, if you'll advance real quick, Jason, is some of these other uses that you may get out of wildlife. And so deer has very interesting and valuable fur that can be used for obviously crafts and clothing, but also for fishing lures. If you're into fishing, you can see this top little spinner here. That's actually made using a squirrel tail. Deer tails can be kind of used in the same fashion. You can fly ties. You can tie flies. You can make a bunch of other fishing lures, but also you can get that hide tanned and turned into buckskin, or you can do it yourself through brain tanning or some of these other chemical processes that you can do at home, and turn them into gloves, into hats. So there's a lot of different options out there other than just food. But with that, I'll turn it back over to Jason and he'll close us out.
Thanks a lot, Dan. So that concludes our webinar. We do have one more webinar for the year, which will be on Thursday. It's going to be Waterfowl Hunting 101. So please join us for that if you're interested in starting up waterfowl hunting at any time or want to learn more about it. And then please look at our Facebook page and our website to look for our January events that will be posted up in the start of January. So you can find us on social media, on Facebook and Instagram. Let's got Illinois Learn to Hunt on each of those. And then also our YouTube channel, which we are adding more and more video content throughout the winter. So keep an eye on that. If we get more subscriptions to that, I think we're around 78 or so. We get up to 100. We can turn that bunch of letters and numbers there into Illinois Learn to Hunt. So that gives us the right to get our own URL. So please go and subscribe to our YouTube channel and help us get that so that way we're more easily found by others looking for information. Also, if you're interested in other topics that we're not having webinars on right now, you can go to our website and look up these e-learning modules. So we have waterfowl, deer, turkey, and upland, and these you can all work through at your own pace. And these were what we had prior to doing the online webinars, before we had workshops where you can come and do hands-on things. But of course, we can't do that this year. But hopefully in the future now, we'll get back to doing that. But in the meantime, join our webinars, look at the YouTube channel, follow us on Facebook, and you can, again, work through these e-learning modules at your own pace. So if you have any questions or anything, we're here to answer them for you. If not, have a wonderful evening.
Looks like we have a few questions. First of all, Adam just posted the link to the survey in the chat. So if you would take that, that would be great. Like Jason mentioned. And Michael, we do a deer hunting 101. I'm trying to think, we probably won't host another one for a few months just because we're going to be getting ready for turkey season. But if you send us an email to the email that kind of sent you this webinar link at the very beginning of the day, just send us an email and ask us for Deer Hunting 101, and I can shoot you a link to a previous recording of that webinar, so you can watch that at your leisure. But you had another question asking about going back to the maps and finding your area. I'm just starting out, no real experience. What would you recommend as a first-time objective to find? Should I spend this winter, spring just looking around? And certainly that's a solid idea, but I would say don't be afraid to go out there and try to hunt. Again, like we kind of mentioned a few times, these reconnaissance hunts are in my opinion arguably one of the most beneficial things any hunter can do, is just observe as much of the huntable land as you can and see how deer are moving through the landscape. But also don't be afraid to talk to other hunters when they're in the parking lot. You can learn a lot, just by conversing with them. Now, not everybody's going to be willing to chat or even share information. There's been several times where I'll try to talk to an individual and they'll just, kind of walk on as they're not interested, and that's fine. But sharing information is a really good tool. But if I was brand new and starting out kind of right now, in kind of mid-December, my first step would be to find changing weather patterns. So again, changing weather patterns is going to influence deer activity, whether it's going to be, a real cold front that's going to get them up on their feet or vice versa. But also what I'm going to look for is rain or snow events, because those are going to be really impactful as to how you can look at an area and say, deer were here yesterday. And so that's really important. I went out with a hunter on Sunday, and we were in kind of this swampy slough area. Obviously, we had a bunch of rain Friday and Saturday, and so we both knew that any sign that we saw was going to be relatively fresh. And we found a lot of fresh sign in a specific area. Granted, we didn't ever see a deer. We heard a few crashing through the swamp behind us. But again, it puts us in play. It gets us in the right spot to hopefully, at least do one or two sits, see what happens, and then kind of refine your setup. Especially this time of year, obviously we want to be cautious about how we set up and where we set up, but you're not going to bust out an entire herd. You're not going to ruin a food source for a week or two. They may not use it the next day, but they're eventually going to return to it just because it's food. They need it. And again, at this point, they've been bumped. They've been jumped out of their beds. They've been disturbed while they're feeding several times every single week. And so it becomes the norm a little bit. And so don't be afraid to just go out there and at least try. But again, my best recommendation for a new hunter is to go out there after a rain event or a snow event and just look around and try to find sign. And if there is no kind of precipitation in the near future, that's when, like Adam mentioned, I'm going to go out and look for old rubs, look for old scrapes. And so rubs are essentially areas on trees where the bucks are rubbing the bark off of the tree with their antlers. And the important thing to keep in mind about rubs and scrapes is rubs and scrapes are typically going to be made in a buck's home range. And a buck's home range is a fairly small area where he's going to be marking sign. Now, during rut, the home range kind of goes out the window as they chase does all across the country and try to kind of move them around and breed with them. But typically, they're going to be making those rubs and sign somewhat close to their bedding area. And so if you find areas that have a high density of deer rubs, that's a pretty good indication that there's a buck within that area, unless he could have obviously been harvested and, earlier in the archery season or during firearm season or muzzleloader. So there is a chance of that happening. But that's what I would be looking for, is fresh tracks, older rubs and scrapes that are obviously from this past year. And then again, just try to do those reconnaissance hunts. If you find these areas that have lots of rubs, maybe try to get up on a ridge top that allows you to look, over kind of a valley at below you, and just kind of see how you may envision the deer kind of moving through that area. JR asks, first, Christopher set up a Reddit page. That's something we've been talking about internally. And if that's something that people would utilize, we certainly will, because we know a lot of people are starting to move away from Facebook. And so if there are other platforms that would be more beneficial, we certainly would be happy to do that. JR, what time frame is a midday hunt? Great question. And so for me, a midday hunt is kind of 11 to about 2:30 or 3. And midday hunts don't have to just revolve around the late season. I notice when I hunt public sites, a lot of people will hunt till 9:30 in the morning, and then everyone will go back to their cars, go back to town, grab lunch, and then you'll start to see people come back around 1:30. I'm gonna sit in the woods as long as I can during those two time frames, because very often what happens is when people get out of their tree stands and they're up walking around, that's going to get deer back up on their feet. Chances are those people walking around are going to bump into deer and push them around. And so that can be really beneficial for you as a hunter. If you can get in and kind of stay quiet and stay silent while other hunters are up and moving around, chances are you're kind of in that, like we mentioned earlier, that sanctuary where there's just not a lot of pressure. And so everything can kind of move to you. And so it's not just a strategy for late season, but around 1 to 1:30 is kind of when I've seen a lot of peak activity in kind of the midday. So I try to get set up around 10:30, 11, give the woods some time to calm down until about 2-ish. Anyone else have any thoughts on those questions? Perfect. Well, it looks like that's all the questions. So we'll go ahead and close out for tonight. So again, if you could take that survey that Adam dropped in the chat, that would be great. And if you don't have time to do it tonight, we will send out a reminder email in a few days with, again, the recording to this webinar, a copy of the PowerPoint slides, and a few other references that you may find useful. So be on the lookout for that in your inbox. Probably early, it's Tuesday. Yeah, so probably end of this week. So Thursday or Friday, we'll try to get that information out to you. But again, thanks for joining us tonight. We hope you guys learned something and have a wonderful evening.